Um, just a note about today and next week. These two sessions are primarily storytelling. So I'll be basically telling a story this week and next week. The reason for that is there's obviously these books are not included in most versions of the Bible. Um, they are in some versions. And I've been doing a lot of research on the various books of the Bible that were included and those that were excluded. And there's quite a number that were excluded. And then some are included in some versions and excluded in others. And one of the primary reasons was that when the theologians and were looking at what was considered the canon for their particular religion and whether or not a book fit their canon or not. One of the characteristics they looked at was it inspired? Is this God inspired? And some people don't believe that the Maccabee books are God inspired, but they do recognize they have historical significance because what's really nice about the books of Maccabee is that historically they're fairly accurate because they were in the first century or the last century BC, and the dates are not. If you look at a lot of the other dates, they put a little C in front of the date, which means circa, around this date. Something occurred around this date, but almost all the dates in the last two sessions here are pretty exact. In fact, we even have a month for some of them. So they recognized that they were historical. Now, there was a book that was not included called the First Book of Enoch, Enoch. It's the only Bibles that I have discovered that it's included in is the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible. It is included in that. However, the Book of Enoch and some of the verses in the Book of Enoch is referenced in the New Testament. So there was recognition that this book was real. In fact, the first book of Enoch was part of the discovery of the scrolls. Oh shoot, what's the word I'm looking for?
Dead Sea.
Dead Sea.
Dead Sea Scrolls. Yes, the Book of Enoch was included in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it wasn't included in most Bibles because it wasn't inspired. But there are some references in there about angels coming to the aid of the Maccabees in some of their battles. So it didn't necessarily fit the mold of being God inspired, but Enoch does reference angels coming to the aid, but none of that is mentioned in Maccabee. So this will be a storytelling time. Now, when we left last week, the Jews had just been allowed to return to Judea to repatriate the land. The Persian king decided he would rather have somebody he could somewhat trust to take care of his territory, warlike, but not too strong to revolt. So he allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. So that's where we were. Now, today we're beginning with the Maccabean revolt. So we're moving ahead 400 years from when the Jews returned to Judea. So really nothing happened for about 400 years after the Jews returned. The battles of the Maccabees did bring forth one of the foremost captains of history by the name of Judah the Maccabee. Now, Judah, it used to be the name of the country before it was changed to Judea. But in this particular instance now, when I refer to Judah, I'm talking about a man by the name of Judah. So Judah the Maccabee. They were the very first battles in recorded history to be fought over the issue of religious freedom. And what distinguishes them is the military genius of Judah the Maccabee because he departed radically from the tactics that were universally being applied at the time, and he instinctively adapted the principles of war in an entirely novel way. The Maccabean revolt opened in 167 BC. Now we're getting close to the birth of Christ here, not that far off. After an extended period in which no organized Jewish force had engaged in warfare. The last battle in which a major Jewish force had taken up arms had been in 586 BC, over 400 years earlier, when the Jewish defenders of Jerusalem fought the losing battle against the invading forces of Nebuchadnezzar. And during this time, this past 400 years, the Jews fought in the armies of other nations, either by force or out of necessity. In the middle of the 2nd century BC, Judea was a small province of the Syrian-based Seleucid Empire. It had been so since the Seleucid monarch by the name of Antiochus III grabbed the area of Palestine from the Ptolemies of Egypt and incorporated Judea into his empire in 198 BC. So before I go any further, let me flash up some maps for you, most of which you've already seen. And this will explain these new empires I'm talking about. So here's the first one. You may recall seeing this map. This shows the extent of the Assyrian Empire that took hold. And remember, Judah was kind of was kind of the only holdout. They were allowed to kind of take care of themselves. They paid a heavy tribute, but they weren't attacked. But that was the extent of the Assyrian Empire. Now, the Assyrian Empire was replaced by the Babylonian Empire, if you recall, which included Palestine. It didn't include Egypt at that time, but Asia Minor, heading towards Persia. This was the Babylonian Empire. But the Babylonian Empire was later replaced with, last week you saw this map, the Persian Empire, which controlled the Palestinian land bridge. So one empire after another, one toppled another, but all of them, as you can see, coveted this territory, okay? Now, we're going to jump to this map. Now in this map, basically there are 3 empires. They started out as one. It was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, who started up here in Macedonia, conquered all this land. And we'll get into a little more detail in just a few minutes. But in the days of Judah the Maccabee, the province of Judea was rectangular shaped area, and each side of the rectangle measured about 30 or 40 miles. The area was mountainous, broken by villages and wadis running down to the Mediterranean Sea in the west and to the Jordan River and the Dead Sea in the east. The population of this province called Judea was estimated to be about 200,000 to 250,000. But in 332 BC, Alexander the Great from Macedonia, up here in the corner, one of the greatest generals in history, defeated the Persians, kicked the Persians out, and took control of the entire Persian Empire, which extended deep into Asia, including Judah, which has now been Latinized into Judea, Judea. On the death of Alexander the Great, at the young age of 32, and he actually died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. That's where he was when he died at the age of 32. He divided, he actually had set up a will, and he divided all of his conquered lands among his generals. the generals who fought with him. And then these generals started to fight each other over the inheritance. One of the generals, by the name of Ptolemy, was assigned the province of Egypt, which covered all of this area, part of Libya, down the Nile, included all of the Palestinian land bridge, even north of Tyre. So he inherited what was called the Egyptian province. Now, he decided to establish himself as a monarch, and he based his capital here in Alexandria. Another general by the name of Seleucus, who had been assigned the province of Babylon, he also crowned himself king, and he set up his capital in a city named after himself, Seleucia, which was on the Tigris River right here, just outside of Baghdad to the south, but it no longer exists. But later he extended his area of control into Syria, and he established a new capital at Antioch on the Mediterranean in the northwest corner of Syria, right here. For obvious strategic reasons, the area of Palestine was coveted by both the Ptolemies in Egypt in the south and the Seleucids in the north. For over 100 years, Jerusalem and Judea remained part of the Ptolemaic Empire. But in 198 BC, Antiochus III, the father of the emperor against who the Maccabees would later revolt against, took Palestine from the Ptolemies, making it part of the Seleucid Empire. The Jews had enjoyed a fairly benevolent rule under the Ptolemies, except for the requirement to pay a heavy tribute. Judea was an autonomous region. The first century AD historian, Josephus Flavius, describes how the Jews were free to administer their own affairs in peace, to practice their religion without fear, and to conduct the traditional Jewish rites in their temple in Jerusalem. This policy of tolerance towards the practice of the Jewish religion and respecting their domestic autonomy in Judea was also maintained when the Seleucids under Antiochus III gained control of Palestine. So all was good. But it changed with the accession to the throne of his son, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. When Antiochus IV came to power in 175 BC, he realized that while he would undoubtedly find himself in conflict with Egypt at some point, the main threat to his empire would come from the growing power of Rome. Judea then became very important to him strategically because of its proximity to Egypt and the fact that from the Judean hills, it dominated the historic coastal route that connected Syria with Egypt, which is well known to you guys at this point. Judea did not pose a military threat to Antiochus. However, with the danger threatening him on his southern and eastern borders, where the Medes and the Medes and the Parthians were starting to stir up trouble for Antiochus out here in the eastern part of his empire. He decided that he needed to secure this vital strategic province of Judea by imposing Greek culture and rites on the population, thereby ensuring a common loyalty throughout the empire. This was the method that he proposed to adopt in order to weld together his subjects, unifying the empire. He decided on Hellenism to be imposed, not only for religious and social reasons, but for political purposes as well. During this process of Hellenizing Judea, and especially Jerusalem, the Seleucids, which are basically Greeks, by the way, the Seleucids assumed the authority to appoint the high priest, who was the spiritual leader of the Jews. And then there was a split between the Hellenized Jews and those who remained true to their traditions and faith. And this split caused a rebellion to break out in the city of Jerusalem. Jews against Jews, Hellenized Jews against traditional Jews. News of this uprising reached Antiochus in 168 BC, just as he was withdrawing northwards along the coastal road from Egypt after abandoning the siege he was conducting at Alexandria against Ptolemy. The withdrawal had been a humiliating move, as he left Egypt under the threat of Roman intervention. In his anger at having to leave Egypt, and then he gets the news of this uprising in Jerusalem, he dispatched forces under one of his generals, Apollonius, to deal with the situation in Judea. The Seleucid troops engaged in a massacre of the Jewish populations in Jerusalem. They burned and pillaged and broke into the temple, stealing many of the precious holy vessels. And then after that, the temple was converted into a Hellenist shrine dedicated to the Olympian Zeus, and the sacrificial offering of a pig crowned the act of desecration. So just outside of the city of Jerusalem, just outside the walls to the north, was a hill, and on that hill, a fortress was built called Acra of the Citadel. It was constructed on the hill facing the temple and commanding it, and it was a permanent Seleucid army garrison stationed there. Steps were taken to impose the will of Antiochus on the rebellious Jews and eradicate the influence of Jewish rites and customs. Jews were forbidden, on penalty of death, to congregate in prayer, to observe the Sabbath and religious festivals, to carry out circumcision, or to adhere to the dietary laws. They were required to participate in pagan rituals, including sacrificing pigs and eating the meat. After subduing Jerusalem, Antiochus continued his goal of de-Judaizing Judea by moving into the countryside with troops under orders to enforce the regulations against Jewish religious practices. One of these units, let me switch maps here. Yeah. One of these units, under an officer named Apelles, arrived here at the little village of Modi'in in the foothills of Judea, just northwest of Jerusalem. An altar was set up in the village, and before the whole assembled population of the town, Mattathias, who was the Jewish priest, was ordered to perform a sacrifice of a pig and eat the meat. With him were his 5 sons. When Mattathias did not move from his spot, someone else in the crowd moved forward to the altar to obey the order and perform the sacrifice. Mattathias then became totally enraged, and he rushed forward and he killed the traitor and killed Apelles. Then his sons led the villagers against the small Greek unit, wiping it out. And thus began the revolt of the Maccabees. Mattathias then led the people of his village into the hills of Gophna. It's just underneath this white placard here, but it's located right about here. Because from here, this region was not very accessible by the garrisons, either in Jerusalem or from the coastal plain. And they could easily defend themselves and not be bothered while they organized and planned the course of their revolt. They numbered about 200, of whom probably not more than 50 were able-bodied men, and they lacked any military training whatsoever. So they hid out in the hills here in Gophna for about a year, and they prepared in relative peace. They trained in guerrilla warfare, and they recruited new members. Emphasis was on the reaffirmation of the principles of Judaism for which they were fighting. They defended themselves when they needed to, but they chose not to initiate any operations while they were organizing their base. At the same time, they strengthened contacts with the villages all through the countryside, and they spread the word about the revolt. Soon, an effective intelligence gathering organization was developed as the militia grew under the leadership of Judah the Maccabee. Mattathias had selected Judah, which was his middle son of his 5 sons, to succeed him before he died during the first year of the revolt. Armed with primitive farm implements and homemade weapons, Judah's small group prepared to give battle to an up-to-date Greek army. The Seleucids were well-trained, well-organized, and proven in battle. They were composed of heavy and light infantry, heavy and light cavalry, chariots, elephant units, and artillery units operating ballistas, which are siege engines that hurled large stones, and various service units. Their weapons included swords, javelins, spears, bows, slings, ballistas, and battering rams. The situation must have seemed hopeless, but Judah recognized many elements that could be put to work in his favor. While the Seleucid troops enjoyed overwhelming superiority in manpower and arms, they were trained only for a set-piece battle in conventional fighting form. They were mostly mercenaries with little or no commitment to any particular cause. And facing them would be a people of the country fighting on their own soil for their own people and prepared to die for their religious beliefs and their freedom. The best way to meet a conventional army trained to fight by day is with unconventional tactics and strike at night. Judah's forces, small as they were, enjoyed one of the basic requirements of a guerrilla force. As Mao Zedong said about 1,000 years later, they were like a fish in water. Judah's fighters came from the local populace in the villages, and they could melt back into the population whenever they needed to. And as they continued with their training, Judah's guerrillas developed and strengthened their supply lines to the villages scattered all over the countryside. By the end of the first year, the force grew to a total of several hundred men bearing arms. An elaborate informal intelligence system was developed that allowed Judah to have full knowledge of the situation in Judea and the region to the north, up in Samaria. Gradually, offensive guerrilla activities were directed against small Seleucid patrols, which they ambushed and wiped out. And the purpose of these hit-and-run tactics was not only to disrupt the occupying forces, but also to create an arsenal of modern weapons for the Jewish rebels. Judah's activities increased. Entire areas of the countryside came under the control of the Maccabees, and the Seleucid garrison, which was located in the citadel outside of the city of Jerusalem, was cut off. Seeing that the situation was deteriorating and the Maccabees had gained the upper hand in Judea, Apollonius, who was the governor and the commander of Antiochus, King Antiochus' forces in this region, was based in Samaria. He decided to intervene. Judah and his forces were to face their first full-scale military operation. The core of the Seleucid army is the phalanx, which is a tactical formation consisting of heavy infantry drawn up in close order. The troops advanced towards the enemy in a tight mass, with the men in each rank shoulder to shoulder and almost on the heels of the rank in front. The principal tactical element of the phalanx was the syntagma, comprising some 250 men, which could be compared to the modern infantry company. The body comprised 16 ranks with 16 men in each rank. In other words, a unit that measured only 15 yards square. 4 syntagma make a shalarchia of 1,000 men. 2 shalarchia numbering 2,000 men and extending over a width of 120 yards and to a depth of only 15 yards constituted the smallest phalanx that was used in warfare at that time. So let me show you a short video about the phalanx.
The phalanx was the main military formation used by the Greek or Hellenic armies, having been created around 700 BC. It was regarded as a form of heavy infantry, and its soldiers were known as hoplites. As a rule of thumb, the soldier was equipped with a 2.5-meter spear, a large round shield, a short sword, a helmet, chest armor, and greaves. This whole set of equipment would weigh around 35 kilograms, and so the armor was only dressed shortly before battle. In a phalanx, the hoplites remained in a tight formation, basically shoulder to shoulder with their brothers in arms. This was something important for the phalanx's defense, since the shields of a soldier, besides protecting him, covered the right flank of the soldier next to him. Left-handed men were not allowed in a phalanx because of that. To keep the formation unified, a flautist dictated the rhythm of the march. The spear was the phalanx's main weapon, which had an iron spike and a metal latch on the other end. This latch allowed the spear to be stuck in the ground in case of a cavalry attack, and also to keep the weapon properly balanced. In some cases, it could also be used as a bruising weapon, particularly in the case where the spear was broken. The phalanx's wall of spears virtually hampered any form of frontal attack conducted by another infantry division that was not a phalanx as well. This is because they could not hit their opponents without first being stabbed by a spear, and, due to their large shields and heavy armor, attacks with items such as arrows, darts, and stones were barely efficient. When in formation, the first two rows of soldiers pointed their spears forward, while the two rows in back tilted their spears at 45 degrees, hence preventing the possibility of having someone trying to launch an attack over the first line of spears. In turn, the soldiers at the back replaced the fallen colleagues, and also pushed their colleagues in front, strengthening the formation. Even though the phalanx was virtually impenetrable in terms of front attacks, since, by being quite a solid body, the phalanx had very little mobility and maneuverability. So, generally, the phalanx had its flanks protected by cavalry or light or minor troops. The only military formation capable of constituting a proper threat to a phalanx was another phalanx. When two units of this kind clashed with each other, usually what decided the battle was the expertise and experience of the hoplites on each side, and the number of soldiers in the rear. The powerful Greek phalanx ruled the battlefields in ancient times. Its reign lasted for several centuries until the appearance of the Roman legion, which due to its mobility and employment of brand new tactics, gradually turned the Greek phalanxes into something obsolete.
Okay. Now let me go back and so as the phalanx advanced on the enemy force, the first 5 ranks held their spears horizontally while the remaining 11 held them vertically. The entire phalanx would press against the enemy once the battle began. It stomped forward, crushing everything in its path when the enemy was weak, and meeting in a head-on clash when the enemy was equal to it. The complex was protected on the flanks by cavalry and light forces, which skirmished before the main force. The weakness of this formation lay in the fact that it was cumbersome and precluded exploiting the element of surprise. As a result, one of the main tactics of war was missing. The progress of a marching column deployed as a battle-ready phalanx was a slow and tedious one. Both sides were in full view of each other, and once the battle began, the developments were in accordance with fixed tactical principles. The concept of achieving tactical or strategic advantage by interfering with the enemy's deployment did not exist. It was simply not done at the time. I find this utterly amazing. In other words, it didn't matter what nation you were from or who you were fighting for. When it was time to do battle, each side left the other side alone so they could deploy their troops properly before the battle began. You know,
like the British.
taking advantage of that, disrupting that was just not heard of. Crazy. All right, let me bring this map back up. go. So in 166 BC, Apollonius' forces moved along the mountain watershed from Samaria towards Jerusalem. He took the direct Samaria-Jerusalem route, which passes along the flank of the Gopna area where the Maccabees were hiding out. According to Major General Abisar's detailed book on the Maccabean battles, Apollonius advanced into Judea with a force numbering some 2,000 men, while facing them was a Jewish force under Judah of approximately 600. To neutralize the Seleucid superiority in both manpower and weaponry, Judah decided to take advantage of the element of surprise. The phalanx is designed for open, flat ground. Judah decided to attack in a defile or a valley, and he would attack them while they were on the march, when they were neither prepared for battle nor able to assume the positions in which they had been trained to fight. The site Judah chose for the fight was in Nahal el Hamarea, which is Nahal, you remember, is the Hebrew word for valley, some 3 to 4 miles northeast of Gopna, in this area right here. At this point, the route southwards from Samaria enters a real narrow defile that winds uphill for more than a mile. The enemy was approaching in columns of 4. So the front of the column was 4 people wide. Judah decided to block the march and then push the Seleucid troops into a situation that would force them to create a front on one of their flanks. In other words, they would have to turn left or right and face an attack from their flank, which they were not trained to handle. They were only trained to fight head on, straight forward, in a phalanx, but now they're only 4 wide. This would place the enemy in a position for which he was least prepared and which he would be most vulnerable. Judah divided his forces into 4 units. One was to act as a sealing unit at the southern end of the defile. A second unit would be the main attacking force, and they would be along the eastern side of the defile, towards which the main force of the enemy would be forced to turn. A third unit would attack from the western side of the defile, while a fourth would be held a short distance north of the main attacking unit on the eastern side, ready to close the northern entrance to the defile and therefore complete the trap. It was late afternoon when the Seleucid forces came marching into the defile in columns of 4. They marched in 2 separate shalarchia of about 1,000 men each, with the commander, Apollonius, riding in between the 2 shalarchias. The forces advanced tightly bunched up in a compact group, with the men behind actually bumping the men in front. At the signal, the sealing unit at the southern end of the defile fell on the leading troops at the head of the column, which was only 4 men wide, and pressed forward, jamming the entire Seleucid force into the defile. At this point, the unit on the eastern slope appeared from their hiding places and attacked the column from its flank. Because they were encumbered by their heavy weapons, which were not suited for fighting in a narrow defile, the Seleucids turned to face this new onslaught, while the rear element of the column kept pressing forward into the defile. At this point, the forces on the western slopes emerged from their hiding places and attacked the Seleucids from the rear. The Seleucids were now trapped under devastating fire from both east and west. Hearing this noise, Apollonius, who was leading the second shalarchia, spurred his horse forward in order to see what was happening. He was killed by the murderous fire from both hills. When the entire Seleucid force was in the defile, Judah personally led the 4th force and closed off the northern entrance. The Seleucid troops were completely trapped, fighting leaderless under conditions for which they had never been prepared. The entire force was destroyed, and all of its weapons and equipment fell into the hands of the Jews. Because of his victory, Judah's influence on the Jewish population increased. He was accepted as the national leader and was now able to impose some discipline among the people. Volunteers rushed to join his forces. By ignoring the accepted methods of warfare, he showed that a small, relative weak force could fight successfully against a mighty army. Judah had demonstrated the importance of that great principle of war, which is morale. He also learned the great importance of eliminating the leader of the opposing side as early as possible. After the defeat of Apollonius's troops, Antiochus, up in the city of Antioch, realized that there was a serious problem in Judea. It was clear that the emperor could not allow a group of rebels to flaunt his authority in such a blatant manner. Rather than make some effort to reevaluate the political and military situation in Judea, Antiochus decided to undertake a major operation to restore law and order in the province and to take firm action against those who opposed him. Antiochus sent General Seron to Judea. The general thought his mission to carry out revenge on behalf of his emperor in an easy campaign against a group of lightly armed guerrillas would enhance his military reputation. He started out early in 165 BC, marching southwards along the coast until he reached the area of Joppa, and then he turned eastward towards the city of Lod. Once he got to the city of Lod, he was now reaching the foothills of Judea. He was only 15 miles or about a day's march from Jerusalem and the nearest Seleucid garrison, which was stationed there. His plan was to join up with the garrison in Jerusalem and then fan out across Judea on a punishing expedition that would destroy the Maccabean revolt. According to 1 Maccabee 3:16, Seron made the pass of Beth Horon. This same pass, which is a secondary route to Jerusalem, was taken by the British 90th Division under General Allenby when he was advancing on the Turks in 1917. It was also the route chosen by Israeli forces on their advance on Jerusalem during the 1967 Six-Day War. Judah was heavily outnumbered. Seron's force was approximately double that of Apollonius, namely a guard phalanx of 4 Shalarchia, numbering some 4,000 troops, while Judah now had approximately 1,000 men. First Maccabee describes the feeling of apprehension among the Jewish forces while they were entrenched in the Judean hills, watching the approach march of the Seleucid forces across the valley of Ascalon. Judah reminded them that they were fighting for their homes, their families, and their belief in God. Once again, Judah decided to ambush the advancing forces in terrain that would neutralize the enemy's advantage in numbers and weapons. The ascent to the pass of Beth Horon, here we go, yeah. The ascent to the pass of Beth Horon runs through a long defile commanded on both sides by steep slopes. Judah would again seal the exit from the pass and then attack the column from both flanks. This time, the Seleucid general Seron rode at the head of his troops. For Judah, the elimination of the enemy commander early in the battle was a primary mission because of the effect it would have on the morale of the enemy forces. According to, the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius, Judah's orders to his troops were that regardless of the numbers of the enemy, who is mighty, we will advance together and reach Seron. This time, Judah could not hope to track the entire enemy force as he had done with Apollonius's troops, because they marched into the hills with wide gaps between the units, and this made their column over a mile long. Seron's forces set out at dawn on what was to be their last day's march before reaching the Seleucid garrison in Jerusalem. The front syntagma of the first Shalarchia began this long winding ascent into the hills towards Beth Horon. It was a slow advance as the troops were weighted down by their equipment and their heavy weapons. Judah's lookouts, who were hiding among the rocks and the olive trees covering the hillside, watched silently as the Seleucid forces advanced up the ascent to the Beth Horon Pass. This time, Judah, who was holding the sword he had taken from Apollonius, and by the way, it's a sword that he kept with him the rest of his life through all of his battles. He led the sealing unit. As the lead element of the Seleucid force approached the ambush site, Judah's men charged the enemy forces, again, who were in a narrow column. They cut down the leading ranks right away, which had been immobilized by surprise. The rear units of the first Shalachia kept pressing forward, while the lead units were staggering backwards under attack by the sealing unit, which found Saron and killed him. At this point, the flank units on both slopes launched a barrage from bows and slings, which increased confusion in this narrow pass, and then they attacked, running downhill full speed with swords in close combat. While the leading Shalachia was decimated and Saron dead, the Seleucid forces broke and fled, and as panic spread, the other Shalachia turned and fled towards the coastal plain, leaving over 800 men, the bulk of the first Shalachia, dead on the battlefield. Judah led his men in pursuit of the fleeing troops, following them down the pass of Beth Horon as far as the coastal plain. Judah had now destroyed 2 Seleucid armies and caused heavy losses in equipment, which he put to good use in arming his own forces. His prestige among the people grew, and he was able to create an army which it's estimated now numbering 6,000 men. He made full use of the principle of surprise and morale and dictated where the battle would take place. It was finally clear to Antiochus that his forces in the province of Judea faced a major rebellion. He was just about to embark on his own campaign against the rebellious elements in the eastern part of his Seleucid empire, the Medes and the Parthians, when he learned the news that the forces in his southern province of Judea were beaten and General Saron was killed. He still needed to put down the rebels on his eastern border and increase his revenue because his funds were quickly running out. He therefore appointed Lysias, a member of the royal family, as his viceroy and guardian of his son, Antiochus, who would later become Antiochus V Eupator, until he was able to return. He had no choice but to transfer a considerable proportion of the forces assigned to his eastern campaign to Lysias for operations against Judea. Antiochus's orders to Lysias are in the first book of Maccabee, chapter 3, verse 35 and 36. Roger.
Okay. Lysias was to send a force against them to wipe out and destroy the strength of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem. He was to banish the memory of them from the place, settle aliens in all their territory, and distribute their land.
So they were to destroy Judah's forces by the use of any and all means, and to uproot and destroy the strength of Israel and the remnant of Judea, to blot out all memory of them from the place, to settle strangers in the territory, and allot the land to the settlers. Lysias chose 3 generals to lead the expedition against Judea: Ptolemy, Nicanor, and Gorgias. Under them, the Seleucid expedition set out along the coast in the spring of 165 BC, and they reached Emmaus, located here, where a major base camp was established. This time, they were obviously not going to be lured into the Judean mountains to be tracked, as in the case of the 2 previous expeditions. The camp at Emmaus was located in the foothills just above the Ajalon Valley. And it was sited in such a way as to ensure the topographical conditions for battle are what the Seleucids required for their formations and weapons to be most effective. The Seleucid strength in this campaign is given in 1st Maccabee at 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, while the 2nd book of Maccabee puts the force at some 20,000 troops, which is generally believed to be the more acceptable number. The Seleucid plan was to develop operations against Jerusalem from this base camp in Emmaus, aided by the garrison that was still located in Jerusalem, and gradually extend activities throughout the whole province of Judea. Judah had, in the meantime, taken advantage of his victory at Beth Horon to prepare his men to face this new expedition, which comprised of about half of the entire Seleucid army. He intensified his recruiting campaign and he began organizing his army into subunits, which bear a remarkable resemblance to those used in modern armies today. He divided his force into units equivalent to battalions, numbering about 1,000 each. These in turn were subdivided into company-like units of 100 men each. Each such unit was again divided into platoon-like units of 50 men each, while each platoon was divided into 5 squads or section-like units of 10 men each. The Seleucids were so confident in victory because they were now joined by reinforcements from Idumea on the southern border of Judea and from the coastal plain. Now you may be asking yourself, what is this Idumea? Where did it come from? We'll talk more about that next week, but basically Idumea is the Greek word for the Edomites. Remember Edom, E-D-O-M? The Edomites had once, Judah had been subjugated, taken control of this whole area in the Negev. And this is just the Greek word for the Edomites. But we'll get back to more of that next week. But so they were gaining their confidence because troops from Idumea and from the coastal plain decided they were joining the party here at Emmaus. Let's see, who had, Jim, you got 2nd Maccabees 8:11?
I do. And he immediately sent to the cities on the seacoast, inviting them to buy Jewish slaves and promising to hand over 90 slaves for a talent, not expecting the judgment from the Almighty that was about to overtake him.
Okay, so Nicanor offered Jewish slaves to the coastal towns, undertaking to deliver them at the price of 90 to the talent. So slave merchants brought large quantities of gold and silver together with large quantities of chains, anticipating a very profitable trade. So what is a talent? A talent is a unit of weight that was introduced in Mesopotamia at the end of the 4th millennium BC, and it was normalized at the end of the 3rd millennium during the Akkadian Sumer phase. It was divided into 60 minas, each of which was subdivided into 60 shekels. The use of 60 illustrates the attachment that the early Mesopotamians had to their useful sexagesimal arithmetic system. And these weights were used subsequently by the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Phoenicians on the coast in the north, and later by the Hebrews themselves. The Babylonian weights are approximately 0.3 ounces per shekel, 1 pound, 1.2 ounces for a mina, and a talent was 66 pounds, 9 ounces. So for a little more than 66 pounds of gold or silver, you could buy 90 Hebrew slaves. On the Jewish side, Judah prepared his forces by dividing them into 4 equal groups of 1,500 men each. Each of the first 3 groups were commanded by one of his 4 brothers, Simon, Johanan, and Jonathan, while he took personal command of the 4th unit. He assembled his army here at Mizpah, some 5 miles northwest of Jerusalem, on the road to Beth Horon. Once again, being greatly outnumbered, Judah worked on keeping morale high. In addressing his forces, he emphasized their links with the past and issued orders in accordance with biblical custom. For example, following biblical law, he released from active duty any service member who was a newlywed or those who had just built a new home. That was according to biblical law of the time. At Mizpah, Judah was well located to cover any of the approaches by the enemy forces up into the Judean heartland. But from reports he was getting from his patrol units, it was clear that the enemy was basing itself at Emmaus. So Judah then moved his forces, all of his forces, to the southeast of Emmaus, concentrating them in the hills right above Emmaus. The two camps were now clearly visible to each other. This time, Judah decided to let the enemy make the first move. And based on enemy patrol activity, it was clear that the Seleucids were planning to initiate an attack directly on the Jewish base above their Emmaus camp in the hills. Gorgias decided to imitate the tactics Judah had used earlier. His plan was to lead a force up into the hills of Judea at night, surprise the Jewish camp, and destroy Judah's forces. He naturally assumed that Judah would never expect a Seleucid attack at night because they were not known as night fighters. So Gorgias moved up into the hills with 5,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry units. Because of Judah's intelligence gathering apparatus, he was well aware of this plan. He decided to employ a trick to draw Gorgias deeper and deeper into the hills of Judea and further away from the main body at Emmaus. First, he ordered a large number of bonfires to be lit in the Jewish camp, indicating the existence of a large concentration of troops. But under cover of darkness, Judah withdrew his forces from the camp, leaving it occupied by only a small rear guard of some 200 men. When Gorgias's forces attacked the camp at night, they found to their surprise that it was empty. But they did observe this rear guard withdrawing as they were intended to. Believing this small rear guard to be the main force, Gorgias then urged his forces on in pursuit of this rear guard, chasing them further and further up into the valley leading towards Jerusalem. And as Gorgias's forces advanced up the narrow defile, he was attacked by the units Judah had stationed there in advance. Meanwhile, 15,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry had been left back at the camp at Emmaus. Judah now prepared to attack this camp and take it by surprise. He sent one group of 1,500 men to wait in an area north of the Seleucid camp. And their role was, when the action started, to attack the camp. With Judah in command of the main attack, leading 3,000 men, Judah moved against the enemy camp at dawn, but learned, to his surprise, that the enemy forces had been alerted and they were already formed up for battle in a phalanx on the plain directly in front of the camp at Emmaus. Judah could no longer attack the camp as he had planned. The element of surprise had been lost, and for the first time in the wars of the Maccabees, he was up against an organized phalanx and forced to fight a type of battle for which his forces were not well trained. But Judah still surprised the enemy, this time tactically, by not following the accepted pattern of military engagement, which would have doomed the Maccabees. He again revealed a flexibility of thought and unusual military leaders at that time. He sized up the situation and he immediately adapted his moves to it. The enemy force was arrayed in full phalanx facing south. So the traditions of the day was that Judah would be forced to attack them directly on their front, because that's the way it was just done back then. But that's not what Judah did. Judah divided his forces up, his command, into 3 groups of 1,000 men each. One of these was to engage the cavalry that was protecting the flank, while at the same time the remaining 2,000 would attack the flanks broadside and begin to penetrate the ranks, carving them into smaller and smaller groups. The phalanx, which had been trained to give battle only on its front in direct confrontation, began to disintegrate as its ranks were engaged in hand-to-hand combat on their flanks. At this point, the northern group of 1,500 men, unaware that Judah's battle with the phalanx and assumed that Judah's forces had attacked the base camp, which still contained about 10,000 infantry men and 2,000 cavalry, attacked the camp from the north. The forces in the camp were unprepared for battle because they had assumed that Gorgias's forces up in the hills had taken care of the comparatively small Jewish force and confident in the knowledge that a protective phalanx stretched across the entire front of the plain, protecting the camp, would cover that approach. The Jewish forces penetrated the camp and engaged its surprised occupants in battle. In this way, Judah succeeded in fragmenting the Seleucid forces. Gorgias with 6,000 troops was chasing an elusive force up in the mountains. At the same time, Judah's forces had broken into the flank of the phalanx and were engaged in hand-to-hand fighting. And at the same time, the force under his brother dove in from the north and was battling the surprise troops still located in the base camp, all going on at the same time. The phalanx broke and fled towards the camp. In the camp, there was pandemonium. Horses and elephants were milling around among the fighting troops, while the large numbers of slave traders and camp followers began to run for their lives, and panic spread. Nicanor's forces broke and fled towards the coast. Some 3,000 of them were killed. At this point, Judah again proved himself to be an outstanding commander, controlling the battle at all times, because he stopped the pursuit and issued orders forbidding the taking of any booty at this time. Judah knew that he had not yet had the chance to contend with Gorgias, so he therefore concentrated all his forces at Emmaus and set it on fire. Gorgias soon realized that he was chasing a phantom up into the valley, and he got reports that the camp was in flames. So he did a 180, turned his forces, which were being harassed by the light Jewish forces in the hills. But as his men came upon the scene of the main battle and saw the camp in flames, they too panicked and fled to the coast. This time, Judah chased them in hot pursuit. The defeat at Emmaus was a most serious blow to Antiochus, and made his campaign against the eastern border in even more jeopardy. In fact, the very existence of the Seleucid dynasty was now threatened. Judah had again gained time and was in fact in total control of Judea, with the exception of the Seleucid garrison that was still in the citadel in Jerusalem, which now was completely cut off. Another large Seleucid army had been destroyed, and huge quantities of weapons and equipment, in addition to much wealth and valuable booty, had fallen into their hands. And as a result, Judah could equip his army, which by now numbered 10,000 men. How's that for a story?
Very interesting.
Judas was very smart.
Yes.
Yeah. You wonder where he got it from, but yeah, like I said, this week and next week is basically story time, because we're not going to get much more out of it than historical perspective. But it's important because some of the events in our last session, which is next week, make you completely aware of what Jesus was born into in Nazareth. In fact, some of the names that you'll hear, like King Herod, for instance, we'll talk about next week, played major roles in the life of Christ. So all of this is leading up to that point. And hopefully you'll get some perspective of what the Jews were facing at that time. So, any questions about this week? Yeah.
I have a question. These battles, how long was the time that these battles were going on? Was this weeks, or was this a longer period of time?
No, everything that we talked about today was like a 3-year period.
Wow. Okay. A lot of activity.
Everything we covered today. Now, keep in mind that we skipped 400 years
Right.
from when the Jews returned to Judea, before the Maccabean revolt, before the incident at Modi'in. It was basically 400 years, nothing was going on. But then once that incident occurred at Modi'in with Mattathias, that began the revolt. And from there until what we just covered was about a 3-year period. And the first year, hardly anything was going on other than Judah was organizing his guerrilla forces.
Okay.
So basically, we only covered 3 major battles today.
Mhm.
And those 3 major battles occurred in about a 2-year period. But I say 3 years because the incident at Modi'in, where they killed the Greek unit there, that kind of started the whole thing.
Pretty gruesome times.
Yeah, well, hand-to-hand combat will be.
Yeah.
Yeah, sort of like playing football with knives.
Terrible.
And it's hard to imagine, really.
It is. It really
Oh.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's blunt instruments and knives and spears. And,
Mm.
Mm.
Yep.
yeah.
Belly to belly.
Just crushing each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
After they were defeated, did they learn from that, and did they stop the shoulder to shoulder and the phalanx, or
Yeah.
No, they never did.
they didn't
Nope.
learn a lesson, huh?
They never did. They stayed with that tradition all the way till the bitter end. The bitter end being when Rome came in and took control of that of the Seleucid Empire. It was Rome that defeated the Greek phalanx, and they did it with the Roman legions, which used different tactics because they learned the weaknesses of the phalanx. In fact, if you Google Rome, Greek, phalanx, a couple of keywords in there, you'll find a video or a number of videos that show how the Roman legion was able to defeat the Greek phalanx. So Roman legion versus Greek phalanx, you'll find some interesting YouTube videos on that.
It's interesting how history people don't learn from it, because look at what the British did when they came into into the colonies.
Yes.
Should have read the book.
Yeah, should have read the book. Yeah. Okay, everybody wear bright red clothes. Everybody line up in a straight line. Yeah.
Well, Pickett's charge at Gettysburg was a Napoleonic charge across an open
Yeah,
field against
I know.
an entrenched enemy. Hello.
Yeah. And in the Civil War, they were still using Napoleonic cannons.
Yeah.
And muskets at the time were notorious for being really horrible in terms of accuracy. Because you could have 2 lines of people 300 yards apart, all take careful aim at each other and all fire, and practically nobody get hit. Those balls, they just went in every direction. I mean, there's a funny tale. I can't remember who said it now, but I'll have to see if I can find it.
That sounds
But,
like when
It was during the Civil War where rifled barrels started to come into play, and rifled cannon, which puts a spin on it that greatly improved the accuracy.
Warren, what is the name of your YouTube channel? I forgot.
Oh, crabs and beer.
I know, you got that written down. Crabs and beer.
Yeah, I think you can find it that way. It's CRABS, the letter N, BEER.
Okay.
Crabs and beer.
That's a good shore name.
Yeah, I
That's a
know.
good beachy name.
Let's see. Is that what I called it? Let's see. Yeah, crabs and beer. So all of these videos, I guess I could stop recording.